So thanks for inviting me. First of all, that's a super interesting topic, and I am highly interested. And I must confess that even though I do research in visualization and have done research in visualization for many years, my area of research is not specific to uncertainty visualization. And there are some colleagues of mine who are really excellent in this space. I'm going to mention some of them in my presentation, but if you are curious about it, please come back to me and I will be happy to tell you more. Because of that, I thought that I would organize my brief talk more about questions that I have or reflections that I could come up with regarding uncertainty in visualization and uncertainty in the time of COVID. So I won't be presenting solutions. I think I'm going to just present ideas that I have about uncertainties that I have about uncertainty. Let's put it that way. So I thought I would start with something that I typically show to my students when I teach data visualization towards the beginning of my course. One thing that I really like to stress, and I think is not stressed enough, is this kind of super simple model of how data visualization works. So we have some reality in the world, right? And the idea is that we try to capture elements of this reality with data and sometimes with statistical models on top of this data. Then we take this data and these models and we map them to some visual representation. Then this visual representation is presented to someone, right? And this person typically has questions that are related to what happens in the world, right? Let me turn on this. Okay, that's useful. So you have some questions. And hopefully, in the most ideal scenario, you come up with answers to these questions, right? However, there are a number of problems there. So typically what happens is that the person who is doing that, so let's say your readers, are people who have what we call a mental model of the world. So in their head, they have some ideas about how the world works. And hopefully, they also have a mental model, even if it's very rough, of what the data represent. And I think we too rarely talk about this, and especially too rarely talk about the fact that what we have here, data and models, are a very coarse representation of reality, and that often, very often, there is a mismatch between what we think the reality is and what we think is represented in the data. So I think COVID-19 is such a perfect example but we could come up with many more examples. So here I tried to come up with a list of first thing that came to my mind, right? That there are many more. So say cases versus people infected. So ideally we would like to know how many people are infected, but what we have is cases. But cases depend on how many tests are performed, when they're performed, where they're performed, and even how they are performed. Hospitalizations. I think we all heard this old debate about whether somebody's hospitalized with COVID or for COVID, right? That's another element of uncertainty. A few days ago, I saw this really interesting article from Financial Times where if you focus on people, I think above 65 years old, there are regions where people have more than 100% vaccine uptake. How does that happen, right? Or some people have been looking into injuries in these virus database, and people say that undercounts or overcounts. So we ideally want to know something that is in the world, but data most of the time have a very partial and skewed story of the reality that we would like to know. So I was thinking, so maybe you could come up with something like, oh, but okay, that's fine. But if you look into science, science is so much better than just data, right? But even science, right? So there are many areas where it's not clear whether there is a consensus or not. You hear one expert, you hear another expert, and they say different things. You can almost always find studies that have different outcomes, even with the gold standard that is randomized controlled trials. For instance, some time ago, I wanted to understand whether meat is good or bad. Good luck with that. If you try, you'll find papers that say that good and papers that say it's bad. Organic food, is it good or bad? Good luck with that again. I think it's very complicated. The question itself is not even well posed. Then you might say, well, but look at meta-analysis. That's the gold standard of the gold standard. No, you can find meta-analysis in many areas that come up with different conclusions. So it's a whole mess. So what are we supposed to do? So I hope this is not going to turn everyone super skeptical, right? I'm trying to give a really strong statement here on purpose, since this is a panel. But one question that I have related to that is, do we need less uncertainty or less certainty? I think that our intuition when we talk about uncertainty is that ideally we would like to have less uncertainty. But at the same time, I guess, or at least that's what I will try to argue for, we want people to be less certain if things are not certain. And I think that's a really, really big problem. So going back to the model that I presented at the beginning, right? I think ideally we would like to have more certainty here, but what do we want here? Do we want people to be more certain or more uncertain about things? So when I was thinking about this problem, I came up with this personal stance that a few things that I think are somewhat true, and I would be happy to get some pushback on what I'm presenting here. So I think that most media are not very good at communicating uncertainty. Sorry about that. I'm going to present in a moment a paper that does some research in this space. I'm not even sure that media try to let people think with uncertainty. And I'm wondering if media are locked in somewhat perverse incentives, because I'm not sure whether uncertainty even sells. So I see a few foundational problems there. First, humans really don't like uncertainty. So anxiety comes from uncertainty, and we don't like to be anxious about things. We really like to be certain if possible. Also, humans like to think dichotomously. We don't really like gray areas. We want something to be either true or not true. But in most situations, things are not true or untrue. And finally, we also really love to think with emotions. There's beautiful research about this idea of system thinking, system 1 and system 2 thinking. That's the work of Daniel Kahneman. There's a really interesting and popular book, Tversky and Kahneman. They talk about, we have these two systems in our head. One is much faster, but is driven by emotion. One is much slower, much more effortful, but we don't like to use it because it takes effort, right? So I see that as a foundational problem. So related to that, there's this paper that I really like to recommend. That's from my colleague, Jessica Holman. She's been working in this space of uncertainty visualization for many years. And she has this interview study, and this paper titled "Why Authors Don't Visualize Uncertainty." So I don't have time to go through it, but I just extracted one thing that I really like. So I don't like, actually. One of the outcomes is that the premise that most people have in industry is that uncertainty omission is a norm. So for instance, interviewing people, we have in scientific communication for the public, the general consensus has been don't quantify your uncertainty. Or a survey respondent described how their work would not be accepted by politicians because other analysts never describe uncertainty. So my more robust visualizations appear less valid if I am transparent, right? So I really strongly suggest to read the paper. There's much more than that. Super interesting. So I think now, I think I have to say a couple of words about visualization. Can visualization help? I think in principle it could. Some things I really like if when visualization is not used to tell you this is how things are, but this is how things could be. And so I think that in this space, there's space for what I call what if visualizations that basically show you what happens if something happens. I really love simulations. So I really love the presentation from Chiki. I think the simulations from Washington Post are amazing. Chiki, I really love what you said about we don't want necessarily to communicate to people what something is, but how to think about it. I would love to see more about that. And there's also a tendency, a trend in visualization, and especially in visualization research, there are a few people who are working with this idea of ensemble visualizations that are basically visualizations that show different possible paths in the future, right? And there's probably much more. I think that's a really interesting space to explore. And of course, there are a number of counter arguments people can come up with. So that's partly why I don't hold these beliefs too strongly, right? But do we have some certainty about some things? Of course we do, right? We don't think that the earth is flat, right? Should we cast doubts on everything? Not at all, not at all. That's not my argument. And isn't the whole point behind science and empiricism to provide some certainty? Of course it is. But some people could say people are not ready to think deeply, right? There's a huge data literacy problem. And this is where I'm super conflicted. I don't know what to think about this. So I think that my conclusion is that I have very little certainty about how to think about uncertainty. But I hope that my short presentation and my questions are going to spur some interesting conversations. That was my purpose here.